Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. During the 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country due to COVID-19, the Reagan Foundation switched to virtual programming to ensure that we were still delivering world-class content, even if you couldn't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. Now that the Reagan Library Museum is back open, we are holding hybrid programming, whereby some are in person and some are virtual. We hope you enjoyed this virtual event. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you Jean Becker, former Chief of Staff to former President George H.W. Bush. In 1988, Jean Becker was a reporter with USA Today and was working on the 1988 election. During the election, she got to know Barbara Bush really well, and following the election, Mrs. Bush's Chief of Staff offered her a job in her press office. That led to helping Barbara Bush write a book, and then becoming President Bush's post-presidential Chief of Staff for over 20 years, a job she claims she never got bored in. She joined us today to discuss her brand new book, The Man I Knew, The Amazing Story of George H.W. Bush's Post-Presidency, a book she says leaves people with a blueprint of how to live their lives. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program with Jean Becker, coming to you from our Leadership Academy Oval Office, joined in conversation by Reagan Foundation Institute Executive Director Jon Bush.
Jean Becker, the Jean Becker who has written a marvelous book, long title, but The Man I Knew, The Amazing Story of George H.W. Bush's Post-Presidency. What a wonderful book, and we're just so delighted to spend a few minutes with you, Jean, to talk about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here with you, Jon, and all the people of the wonderful Reagan Foundation. I mean, what a great partnership and friendship our two former bosses had.
Absolutely, you bet. Let me first. This is not your first book. You've written a book prior to this, correct?
I did. It did not have my name on the cover. I'm going to roll back. I have a copy of it right here. After Mrs. Bush died, with the permission of the 5 Bush children, I wrote this book, but put her name on the cover. It's about all the advice Barbara Bush gave out in her lifetime. She was the biggest advice giver of anyone any of us would ever meet. And we called it Pearls of Wisdom. And, it's just, I felt like I just had to share some of her gems. And after I finished that book, I decided I needed to share some of his too.
Yeah, there is no one on this planet that could have written the book you did about George Bush, George H.W. Bush, President Bush 41. And I say that because, it's like written by a member of the family, and I think that's the way you felt you were treated, right?
The President Bush and Mrs. Bush, they did make me feel like family, as did their 5 kids and the grandkids. I was his chief of staff for 25 years, Jon.
Yeah.
And it is true, by the time he died, I don't think there were anything about either one of them I didn't know. In the process of helping them with their books and projects, I even have read both of their diaries. I used to try to blackmail them with that. I used to say, I've read your diaries. What is that worth to you? And yeah, I didn't get anywhere with that.
Now, this pandemic that we're still living through, but that hit with real ferocity almost a couple of years ago, there was a silver lining in that for you, right? I think it seems like maybe that's what gave you some pause and allowed you the time to write this book, right?
Gosh, you could not be more perceptive. I was in New York City beginning to promote Pearls of Wisdom. It came out March 1st of 2020. And while I was in New York City is when the pandemic really started to gather steam. By the time I left New York, I knew we all knew the country was in trouble. So I came back to Houston rather than launch a book tour. I came back to Houston, did a virtual book tour for Pearls, but I started writing The Man I Knew. And what a gift to me. I had the time. It gave me purpose. It gave me, it was cathartic. I spent the pandemic writing this book. And sometimes people are surprised by how fast I wrote it. But let's face it, we didn't have much else to do.
Yeah.
I just wrote my heart out, and it saved my life. It saved my life during the pandemic.
Yeah, I bet. I totally get that. Now, we've talked about how the Bushes treated you like family, but you didn't grow up with the Bushes. You didn't grow up in the Bush family. How were you first introduced to the world of the Bushes?
It's a great question. I actually grew up on a farm in Missouri. I also grew up a Democrat. So our worlds could not have been further apart. My dad, a Missouri farmer, one of the smartest people I knew, but he didn't even graduate from high school. So it was an interesting journey, but it was all because I was a newspaper reporter. And over the years, John, I loved teasing President Bush that he had a former newspaper reporter as his chief of staff. And he would say, "How did I let that happen?" I'm like, I don't know. But I was at USA Today in 1988, and I was part of their campaign team, their election team. I was the political team feature writer, which means it was the best gig. I did this whole at-home series with all the candidates and their spouses. I think there were 15 of them in 1988. I'd have to recount. But I got to know all of them, but particularly George and Barbara Bush and Michael and Kitty Dukakis. Because when it got down to just the two candidates, we, of course, zeroed in on them. And Barbara Bush and Kitty Dukakis agreed to write a weekly column for USA Today in September and October during the general election. And I was their editor. Mm-hmm. And that is really what led to my making that jump to the White House, because after the election, Mrs. Bush's team was being put together by her chief of staff, Susan Porter Rose. And Marlon Fitzwater had given Susan the advice, you need someone in her press office who was a reporter, not, because everybody else at that point was campaign people, PR people. You need someone with either TV or newspaper experience. And that's how I landed in the White House. And the rest is history.
Yeah, and so you go into the White House, but you're not working directly in the press office for President Bush, but rather, I think, for Barbara Bush, right, as First Lady.
I'm in the East Wing. That's exactly right. I was in the East Wing working for her.
Okay, so now I know it's not easy but let's fast forward past the Bush presidency, because your book covers the Bush's post-presidency, but what in the world could be worth writing about post-presidency for a United States president? How can you fill a book with that?
I get asked that a lot in my in book events and virtual book events, and I always say the same thing. It is well. The whole time I was his chief of staff, sometimes friends and family would say to me, "What is it you do exactly?" So one of the things I love about this book is that it does give people an insight into the craziness of the life of a former president. There's an entire chapter called I Have an Idea. Right. It was the 4 scariest words George Bush would ever say to me. And he said them, John, at least 3 times a week, unless he was traveling. It was almost always at 7 o'clock in the morning. He would come bounding in the office. He would have had a pot of coffee. He would have read 4 newspapers. And I could hear him come in the door, and he would say it even before he got to my office. Jean, I have an idea. Yeah. And I would just, oh my gosh, here we go. And sometimes it would be something simple like, you want to go get pizza for lunch today? And I'd be like, And other times he would dump on me the following. These are two great examples. Jean, I've decided I want to parachute again. I haven't parachuted since World War II. I need a do-over. So let's work on that. And the first question I asked him that morning, have you told your wife you're thinking of doing this? And he said, no, I'm going to tell her tonight. Well, she's drinking her nightly Manhattan. I'm like, okay. The bigger challenge was the day he came in. It was January 2nd of 2001, maybe 2002. But it was right after the holidays. I'm thinking just sort of, get a slow roll into the new year. And he comes bounding in and says, Jean, I would like to go back to Chichijima, which is where he was shot down.
Yeah.
It's one of the hardest things I did for him as his chief of staff. It'd be second only to his funeral, probably. And I will just say this, Jon, it's not easy to get from Houston, Texas to a volcanic island in the middle of the South Pacific with no airport. But he was a man in constant motion, and it was never boring. He was a doer. So it was a lot of fun. It could be exhausting, but it was never boring.
Yeah. Well, I put that question to you facetiously, given I've had somewhat of a similar role. So towards the front of the book, and we're now post-presidency, you relate that first year was not an easy one for President Bush, right? He had just lost to Bill Clinton. You quote the president in the book. He's written, apparently, I lost the election, my mother died, my dog died, and my boat crashed. There's not much left that can happen to me in this year, right? A really tough year.
Tough year, and I was more or less an observer that first year. I went to Houston with them to help Mrs. Bush write her memoirs. That's what I did all of 1993. And I didn't know him well. I had met him when he was president, but in photo receiving lines, the annual staff Christmas party type of thing. I didn't know him at all when he was president. I'd interviewed him back in '88. But I didn't know him well. And looking back on it, I realized, Jon, and certainly Mrs. Bush talked about in her diary, and some of his close friends, the big thing about George Bush that year is he was just quiet. President Bush was not a quiet man. He is the ultimate extrovert. He was outgoing. He enjoyed people. He liked to go places, do things. And he was just pretty introspective that year. And there was no place for me in the office, literally, physically, not a place for this woman that Barbara Bush brought with her to Houston to help her with her memoirs. So they put me at a card table in his kitchen. He had a tiny little kitchen in the office. We rammed a card table in there, and that's where I sat to work on her book. And that's how he and I became friends, because he would come in and make coffee or get a glass of milk for lunch. And that's how I really got to know him. And it was later, after I'd been his chief of staff for a while, that I realized how really quiet he was. And we also knew that he wrote a lot that year. He wrote memos to himself that he then filed away. One of them I didn't find until I was working on this book, a memo he wrote to himself about what he wanted his post-presidency to look like and what he didn't want to do and what he did want to do. And I think one day he woke up and thought, okay, I'm back.
Yeah. And now, I don't know if that was exactly when he pronounced he's back and he leaves that introspection, but I know he came to you. It's a wonderful story in the book where you said, look, why don't you be the acting chief of staff? You be the seat warmer, right? But that lasted a little longer than that title than you thought it would, right?
I think some people swear I'm making this up. And I teased him about this conversation 20 years later. And he accused me of making it up. But we had just finished, Mrs. Bush's memoirs were about ready to come out. I was leaving. I had a couple of job interviews to go. I was going to be a reporter again. I was going back into the newspaper business. And his longtime staffer, his first post-White House chief of staff, Rosa Maria, was getting ready to retire. She had told him, I'll come for 1 year to Houston, and then I'm going back to DC. So he called me in and he said, I don't know, I need to hire a chief of staff. I really don't have any good ideas. I need to think this through, but I need someone just to sort of fill in to help keep the trains on time. And he used the term seat warmer. I need a seat warmer. Now, I told him, John, I didn't know how to be a chief of staff. I says, I've never been anyone's boss, never done a budget. I don't know how to do this. And he said, don't worry about that. We'll get through it. We'll figure it out. This was in March of 94, and he promised me by Labor Day he would have a chief of staff in place. We never talked about it again. We got too busy. We never talked about it again. That was it.
Yeah, so you get the quote unquote, the acting chief of staff for darn near 25 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah, just amazing, amazing. It's a great story. Now, you'd mentioned, especially during that first year after the loss in 92, that he found himself writing a lot of memos to himself. He was a prolific writer, was he not? I mean, throughout his professional career and certainly post-presidency. And he had to have been, I think, because the evidence of that is in your book, the phenomenal amount of writing that he did that you were able to quote, right?
Great writer, and between us and I guess everybody who's watching, it sort of irritated me. I teased him one time. I said, you know what, everybody should have one God-given talent, and I think mine is writing. I hope mine is writing. I said, yours was to be president of the United States. It irritated me what a great writer he was, but he was a prolific letter writer and had written letters his whole life. In fact, instead of doing autobiography, we published a book of his letters in, I think, 1998 called All the Best. And it's all the letters he'd written over the years. But in his post-presidency, he wrote letters, he wrote lengthy emails, he wrote memos. His good friend, Christopher Buckley, was editor of Forbes magazine's FYI at that time. And Chris would ask him once in a while to write an essay for him. And they're Pulitzer Prize winning essays. They would include everything from fishing, advice to young people, and one of my favorite memos / essays, advice to former presidents, how to be a good former president, which he wrote right before Bill Clinton left office in 2000.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. 2000. It's a good segue. A very rare historic incident occurred in that another member of the Bush family becomes the president of the United States. Right now, this is right about the time then that it became a necessity to refer to the different President Bushes as 41 and 43, right? Really just an amazing thing. But I get a strong sense from reading your book, Jean, that President Bush 41, we'll now use those terms, was very careful about stepping forward and giving advice to Bush 43 when he was president starting 2000, right? And why was tell me, that tells you something about 41.
It was complicated, and really this began in 1994 when George W. ran for governor of Texas and Jeb ran for governor of Florida. And despite the fact that their father had lost the 1992 election, he still was casting a very long shadow. And it was important for both sons, for both George W. and Jeb, to step outside of their father's shadow. They needed to run as their own people and what they believed in, their own issues. And there is actually a great letter in the book that he wrote his two sons, in which he encouraged them, if you want and need to disagree with me in public, go right ahead. I get it. I didn't get everything right. Nothing will interfere with my love for you. So he considered himself their biggest cheerleader. And obviously he would campaign for them and did a lot of fundraising for them. But he did not give out a lot of advice because he knew that they had this and they didn't need their old man second guessing them. And one of the smartest things I did, John, after 43 became president, and this has been the terrible news for every historian, particularly historians, to some extent reporters. When the two of them talked on the phone, the two George Bushes, I got up and left the room. If I was in the room when the President of the United States called his dad, I would get up and leave. And a couple of times, President Bush 41 said, "No, Jean, you can stay. And I didn't, because I did not feel it was my business to know what they talked about. As one of the smartest things I knew, because every historian has tried to get me to leak like a sieve what they talked about, and I'm glad I don't know. That's not my story to tell.
Yeah, well, what you just relayed, Jean, that says a lot about President Bush 41. What a great father he was, no doubt about it. And a great chief of staff that you were, to have the instincts and the judgment, to know, I'm sure without even being told, that you wanted to make sure that those conversations were private. Let me talk to, one of the points you make in the book, Jean, is, okay, especially with an active former president like President Bush, it involves a phenomenal amount of work. And one of them is when they decide to go on foreign travel, for example, like you just noted, where he was shot down in World War II. Tell me, of all the various places that you ended up going to around the world, what was do you have a favorite trip that you had with him to another spot on the globe?
I do. I'll bring up two trips that are completely different. And the second one will be sort of a segue into the odd couple. Probably my favorite trip would be the trip back to Chichijima. It was logistically very difficult to organize. The thing that saved us is that the great Howard Baker, the former senator from Tennessee, was the U.S. ambassador to Japan at the time. And he was very helpful to us. The U.S. Navy wanted to take President Bush back there, but we were sort of afraid of the optics because his son was president. And so what's interesting about Chichijima, John, is that it was the Japanese Navy who took him, who ended up facilitating his visit. But it was incredible to be a fly on the wall watching him revisit one of the signature events in his life when he was shot down. And I'll end there. I will invite everyone to read the book, but it really is it was an incredible journey. The second trip would be, and I did not travel with him a lot. Whoever his personal aide was at the time was the one who always traveled, but I went on the trips, sort of the bigger, more significant trips where either I felt I was needed or I just wanted to go.
Sure.
I would insert myself in the traveling squad. In 2004, while most of us were having a lovely Christmas dinner with our families, a horrific tsunami hit South Asia. And it's considered one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the world that we know of. And one of the things that the President of the United States, George W. Bush, did, he, of course, sent all the resources of the United States. USAID went in, the Navy went in, with literally an aircraft carrier parked itself off the coast of Indonesia and was helping with rescue missions. But what we needed more than anything was a huge fundraising effort to help our nonprofits, to help the Red Cross, to help Doctors Without Borders, to help AmeriCares get the resources they needed to go in and help South Asia. So the president asked his dad and Bill Clinton to join together to raise money for the nonprofit sector. And they agreed. And then in February, the president asked the two of them to travel to those countries to represent him, to meet the heads of state, to visit the region, and to come back and give him an eyewitness report. And as I said in the book, they left on that journey as colleagues, polite. They were on a mission that they both believed in, and they came home best friends. And in many ways, John, it was that friendship that really turned my life upside down, because the two of them went into the disaster relief business. They did Hurricanes Katrina, Hurricane Ike. Years later, they did Hurricane Harvey, also with the help of President Obama and President Carter. But that was one of the bigger passions of President Bush's post-presidency. If there was a disaster somewhere in the world, he got involved with the Pakistan earthquake. That was actually through the United Nations. And it also was the beginning of his friendship with Bill Clinton.
Yeah, and I want to come back to Bill Clinton in just a minute. But before I do, a whole nother part of the book that you, where you write, Jean, is, boy, there was not just a lot of work when he traveled, but also all of the meetings that took place in Kennebunkport, right? And so many different world leaders and guests that came to visit to talk with the president. Is there one meeting or another that took place in Kennebunkport where you thought, wow, that was really something?
You know, my answer might surprise you. There were some great meetings. President Gorbachev came to Kennebunkport. President Clinton, of course, came to Kennebunkport a number of times. John Major and Brian Mulroney were constant. They were his best friends. They were his best friends on the world stage. Brian Mulroney came every summer. John Major came almost anytime he was in the United States. Once was invited, and I'm not going to remember his name, but he was the president of Azerbaijan. I hope I said that. Did I say that correctly? I hope.
Azerbaijan, yes, yeah.
He was the president of Azerbaijan. He was the first president post the Cold War. It had been part of the Soviet Union, and it was one of the countries that became an independent and a new country after the Soviet Union collapse. And I was invited to an empty seat at the dinner table. My job was to entertain his staff. But they got into this conversation. And I'm not sure, I don't think I put this in the book. I'm pretty sure there's a lot about this in Secretary Baker's book. One of the big problems in when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War came to an end, all good news. But the Soviet Union obviously was a nuclear power, but their nuclear weapons, just like here in the United States, the nuclear silos are here, there, and everywhere. Well, it was the same thing with the Soviet Union. And some of these nuclear silos were in these brand new countries. So all of a sudden, you have nuclear warheads in countries like Azerbaijan was one of them. And this president started talking about how they were getting phone calls every single day from terrorist groups, from the PLO, from offering them huge amounts of money to buy these nuclear warheads. And truly the hero of this is Secretary James Baker. Secretary Baker flew all over the world after the end of the Cold War, meeting with the heads of all these countries. He later told me that he drank a lot of vodka while on this mission. But he was the one who convinced all these brand new countries who could have gotten millions of dollars for their nuclear weapons. He was the one who convinced all of them to give them up, and they all did. But I was a fly on the wall of that president telling President Bush about his conversation with Secretary Baker while Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO, was waiting in a plane on the tarmac at the airport to offer him a lot of money for their nuclear warheads. And I remember sitting there thinking, I grew up on a farm in Missouri. How and why am I sitting at this table?
Yeah, yeah, boy, some historic moments. Absolutely, what a story, Jean. You mentioned President Clinton and how after that first trip, they became fast friends. What was your impression during those times of President Clinton? Because, obviously in the days of partisan warfare, Republicans are not supposed to like Democrats and vice versa. But what was your impression of President Clinton after getting to know him?
One of President Bush's, before I tell you my impression, I will just tell you that one of President Bush's greatest virtues, and something that I learned from, is he had this unique ability, John, to see the best in everybody.
Yeah.
And he didn't hold grudges. He was not a grudge holder. And President Clinton would be the perfect example of that. The 1992 election was brutal. I did an interview the other day where a reporter reminded me that late in 92, President Bush said about Bill Clinton, "My dog Millie knows more about foreign affairs than Bill Clinton does." I mean, there were some pretty strong things said during that election. But when he and President Clinton took that tsunami trip, and I'll tell you just a little bit how that friendship developed, but President Bush, he didn't see the man that he ran against in 1992. He didn't see the man of controversy or scandal. He saw a man who had a big heart, who wanted to do good, who loved people. President Clinton, talk about a great politician. He's one of those people, he walks into a room and he has that ability to make everyone there feel special. It's a gift. And when we went on the tsunami trip, President Bush was in the early stages of Parkinson's. We did not know that then. He had not been diagnosed, but certainly his family and the staff noticed that he was a little unsteady on his feet, and he needed help sometimes getting up and down stairs. And so we put a bug in President Clinton's ear to sort of keep an eye out for him. The staff needed to stay out of the photos whenever possible. And so we asked President Clinton to sort of keep an eye on him, getting off and on the planes, getting up from a chair, getting up from a table. And President Clinton took that to heart. He was so protective of him. He gave him the only bed on the airplane. I did do my part. I stayed up all night playing Oh Hell with him, a game that he taught me, a card game he taught me. The flip side of this is President Clinton is famous for running late. President Bush is famous for always not being on time, for being early. President Bush so the two of them, that was a cultural divide between the two of them. And President Bush took it upon himself to keep him on time. He would say, "Bill, quit talking. You've talked enough. We're going to move on." He would pull him out of a room. He'd say, "Bill, get in the car." And President Clinton would say, "Yes, sir." It was just sort of interesting to watch this friendship, this relationship evolve. Mrs. Bush would tell you she really thinks that her husband was the father that Bill Clinton never had.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really something, really. You also relate that President Bush became friends with President Obama as well. I don't know if it was as close as the relationship with Bill Clinton, but they too got along, right?
They became friends as well. They weren't quite as close, mainly because they didn't work on these big projects together. But President Obama had a lot of respect for President Bush. He gave him the Medal of Freedom very early in his presidency, and that really meant a lot to President Bush. And he also said to President Bush, "Anytime you're in DC, would you please let me know? I would love for you to come over and have a cup of coffee." And President Bush said, he just said that to be nice, Jean. Well, I would sometimes get a call from the White House, usually Valerie Jarrett, saying, "Yeah, we know that President Bush is in town tomorrow, and the president would really love for him to come over and have a cup of coffee." So they just developed this friendship. President Obama came to his library to do a big event for Points of Light. And one of the funniest things that happened, and when I wrote the book, I tried to research what was going on. at this time, and I struck out. But President Obama was coming to Houston to do a big Democratic fundraiser. And President Bush was really upset at some of the press the president was getting. He thought it was unfair. Whatever the issue was or whatever had happened, he was on President Obama's side. And he announced to me the day before the President of the United States was coming to Houston, he says, Jean, I'm going to the airport to meet the president. And I said, really? You are? I said, why? He says, because the president's coming to town and that's what you do. And I said, well, sir, with all due respect, you never met President Clinton for 8 years. And then I realized you never met your son. And of course, George W. would always come see his parents when he was in town. So I said, why now? And he says, because I want to. I want to be at the bottom of those stairs, Air Force One, when he lands. And that was so President Bush to do that. He had a statement he wanted to make, and all he needed to do was show up. And President Obama never forgot that. I mean, Air Force One lands, and there at the bottom of the stairs is one person. The White House, you know how usually when the president comes to town, you have that whole big line of the mayor and the governor. The White House eliminated everybody else. It was just George Herbert Walker Bush in his wheelchair at the bottom of those stairs.
What a gentleman. What a gentleman, really. Just magnificent story. I get the sense as well, Jean, that both he and Barbara, the First Lady, they really had a sense of humor. It's just, the book is filled with moments with sense of humor, right?
Yes.
Now you have a sense of humor too, because there's a story.
You have to be working for them.
You do. And there's a story you relay, and oh boy, do I ever cringe at this story. You must double cringe, but you are strong enough to tell it. But I want you to tell the Richard Holbrooke story. You tell it in the book, so I'd like people watching to hear this story.
Oh, this is a terrible story on me. Oh my gosh. And I would not have put it in the book if he had not died. So President Bush is going to Berlin for the grand opening of the American Embassy in Berlin for the first time since the Berlin Wall had come down. The embassy is moving back to Berlin. And President Bush is representing the United States. And Richard Holbrooke, who was very involved in German-American affairs, was wanting to load up President Bush's plane with a lot of people. And I'm not going to name the people because some of them are still alive, and I don't want this to be a tell-all. But President Bush really did not want some of these people on his plane. He told me, I will jump out of the plane into the Atlantic Ocean. And so Richard Holbrooke decided to wear me down, that the best way to get me to say yes to this, he could never get to President Bush. He had to talk to me, God forbid. He called me every day.
Yeah.
And about the fifth time he called me, John, there was a fellow staffer in the office, and the receptionist buzzes me and says, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke's on the phone for you. And I asked her to put him on hold for a couple minutes. I just needed to collect my thoughts. And what I really did is I turned to Laura Pears, the staffer in my office, and I just unloaded. The F word was just flying. And I mean, I was just like, I'm blah, 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 blah. And, you'd have to bleep out this entire section if I told you what I said. And then I took a deep breath. And I told the receptionist, go ahead and put Ambassador Holbrooke through. And I hear the voice say, Jean, this is Ambassador Holbrooke.
Oh, God.
She had put him through in the very beginning. So the story I handled this so unprofessionally, John, because I did I did such a cowardly thing. Cowardly. I hung up. I was so taken aback that he had just heard me that foul, vile unleashing. I hung up. President Bush was out of town, thank heavens. And I immediately called Brent Scowcroft. I said, Brent, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what I just did. So he, I have great respect for Ambassador Holbrooke, but Brent said, after I told him the whole story, he says, if this story gets out, you'll be the most popular person in Washington. I'm like, oh, no. I said, and then his one of his right-hand people, Jenny Mulberger, wanted to know if she could leak it to the Washington Post. I'm like, no. So Brent's advice to me was not to call him back. I said, should I call him back? Do I apologize? I said, I just hung up on the guy. And Brent said, Jean, you have no idea what he heard. He said he maybe heard all of it. He maybe heard none of it. If you call back and apologize for something that he didn't hear, he says, just let it play out. Well, Jon, I never heard from him again. And one of the few other people I told this horrible story to was Ryan Crocker, who at that time was dean of the Bush School at Texas A&M. He got called back into service and went to Afghanistan to be the American ambassador to Afghanistan. But I called Ryan and told him, because I knew he knew Richard Holbrooke well. Well, Ambassador Holbrooke died of a heart attack just a couple months later. And Ryan Crocker called me and said, oh my God, you killed Richard Holbrooke. He never recovered, Jean, from that phone call, ever. And you broke his heart and you killed him. So anyway, that was one of my low points. And President Bush never heard the story. I never told it to him.
Yeah. Well, I good on you for telling that story so openly, Jean, because a lot of people don't have the courage to relate sometimes their mistakes and that sort of thing. So it's really, congratulations. That really, when I saw that in the book, I thought, wow, she's really doing a great job here.
Let me quickly give credit to my editor. Sean, the stories in the book is the chapter called This Isn't the White House Anymore. And after my editor, Sean Desmond at 12, who I love, Sean read the first draft and he said, I told a couple of stories on myself, but he said, Jean, what's the dumbest thing you did as his chief of staff? What is the one thing you regret the most? He challenged me to tell that. He didn't know what the story was. And so when I wrote it up, he said, yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah, that's a good editor. Good on him, really.
Yeah.
Tell me, what is the fascination that President Bush 41 had with skydiving and essentially the hobby that he made out of it? Where did that come from?
He jumped 8 times in his post-presidency. The last time was on his 90th birthday. His wife was not happy with him. He landed at St. Anne's, their church in Kennebunkport. And Mrs. Bush literally said to him, and then she said it publicly a lot after that. She said to him, well, if it goes wrong, we'll just carry your body in the church and have your funeral right there and then. It definitely stems from him being shot down in World War II. His plane was shot down. He had to parachute out. His 2 crew members did not make it out alive. And he never really found out what happened to them. If they went down with the plane, it was never, no one knew, but they didn't make it out. He parachuted out. He said it was not a clean parachute. He hit his head really hard on the wing and gashed open his head. He lost his life raft. He said it was a sloppy, not clean jump. And I think he actually hated the term do-over. I use that term. He wanted to parachute one more time. He said, I want to know what it feels like to parachute, not in wartime, not with someone shooting at you. He says, I need to parachute one more time. Well, he just loved it. He said it was one of the most peaceful, but yet exciting things he ever did. The excitement of plummeting towards Earth at however many miles per hour, and then you open the parachute, and then you just gently float down. He said it was one of the most exciting sensations he'd ever had. So he did it a total of 8 times, usually to raise money for a good cause.
Yeah, well, that's yeah. I think your analysis of his interest in doing that's really neat. I thank you for that. The Jon Meacham book. Okay, so of course anyone who reads that book just, you know, how can you not have admiration for President Bush after that? But you write in your book that was a difficult moment for you when that book was about to be published and then published. Talk about that.
Well, Jon Meacham was he first surfaced in our life as the editor of Newsweek magazine. And Newsweek magazine was not beloved by President Bush or anyone in Bush world. They were very famous in 1988 they ran a cover of him calling him, I can't think of the word. Do you remember the cover?
Yeah, it was this was what started the wimp factor, right?
The wimp factor, thank you. See, it's so, we hate it so much, I blocked it from my mind.
I understood.
This huge cover of him driving his boat saying the wimp factor. And pretty much in Bush world, the Newsweek magazine was sort of, they're out.
Yeah.
So what happened is he and Brent Scowcroft wrote a book right out of the White House called The World Transformed, all about their foreign policy during the 4 years they were in office. And Michael Beschloss, the great historian, and President Bush was a big fan of his, was going to review the book for Newsweek magazine and write an essay. And Michael asked permission to bring the editor of Newsweek with him. The President Bush and Brent said they would talk to Michael. Brent had to talk President Bush into it. And I still remember the conversation. Brent said, this isn't a reporter, this is Michael Beschloss. He's a historian. But then Michael had to complicate things by asking if he could bring Jon Meacham with him. And President Bush begrudgingly said yes. And he said 30 minutes. I'll give them 30 minutes at 7:30 in the morning over coffee, and then they're out, and then I get the rest of my day back. Well, they left at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Wow.
It was classic George Bush. They had breakfast, they had lunch. He took them out on the boat. And Jon Meacham, he will admit this, that he became intrigued by George Herbert Walker Bush. And I maybe put this in the book where he said John was young when he was editor of Newsweek. He was like in his late 20s, early 30s. His impression of George Bush was was Dana Carvey on Saturday Night Live. And he just became intrigued by him. And after a while, John had started writing books, and he reached out to President Bush and said, I would like to do your biography. And it was not what you would call, it was not in cooperation with. We were going to cooperate. He wanted our cooperation, but we would not be involved at all in any of the content. But he did want to say to President Bush, I hope you will cooperate. Among other things, I would love to read your diaries. And I was shocked, John, when President Bush said yes. I was really surprised. But by this time, he'd seen John a couple of times. John was very close to Billy Graham. And President Bush gave Billy Graham came to his library, and President Bush had given him the George Bush Award for Distinguished Public Service. John came to that and spent time with President Bush and Billy Graham. So President Bush said, yes, I will let you read my diaries. I will help. Jean will help open the doors for interviews. Oh my gosh, people were not happy. People thought I had lost it, and they wanted to blame me.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want to be mad at him. Marlon Fitzwater chewed me out. Marlon called me up and said, what the hell are you doing? The biggest chewing out I got was from the 43rd President of the United States.
Oh, boy.
Definitely thought I had lost it. So what happens is John took him 10 years to write the book. He said writing about someone still alive is one of the hardest things he's ever done. That was really hard because he said you have to interview all these people. So all these people are still alive. But in the meantime, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on Andrew Jackson, which I felt was a lifesaver for me. I love being able to say, well, Pulitzer Prize winning author Jon Meacham, his next book is about President Bush. And then the book comes out, so I was feeling pretty good about it. And the book comes out, oh my gosh, and the press the first day, I'm watching all the Sunday morning shows, and they're obsessed with the fact that President Bush was critical to John about Dick Cheney in the book and called him an iron ass. He was critical about Donald Rumsfeld. He was critical about some of 43's team. And the media was just going nuts. And I'm watching it here at home in my house. And I'll never forget on Meet the Press, one of the panelists said, the book came out in the fall, right before the holidays. And one of the panelists said, boy, that's going to be an interesting Thanksgiving dinner in the Bush household. I thought, okay, my life is over. Oh my God. And everything that Marlon and everyone told me would happen has happened. I love the book, but I thought, oh my gosh. Well, that Sunday night, I happened to turn on TV or someone texted me and said, I hope you're watching C-SPAN. And there's Jon Meacham at George W. Bush's presidential library. And George W. is interviewing him about the book and telling John, I love your book. I love this book. And I'm thinking, okay, I guess I overreacted. But the book gave me heart failure and I overreacted. But the funny thing is, the next day I went into the office. I showed President Bush all the press. I said, typical of any book, they have zeroed in on anything controversial you said. And I said, I need for you to read this. You need to know what's going on out there. And he read it all. And he looked at it and he said, I'm pretty sure I did say all that to John. I said all those things. And he said, so I'm not worried. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. What a high wire act a job like yours can be, Jean. It really is something.
My life would flash before my eyes now and then.
Yeah, I bet. You talk in the book about the point that the president reaches in his life where some major landmarks and objects are being named in his honor. Everything from, well, we'll just take the airport in Houston, for example. But do you think he had a favorite of all those things named for him, or he took the greatest pride in it?
Yes. It's a hard question to answer. The two things that meant the most to him were the USS George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier. That meant everything to him. That the Navy would name an aircraft carrier for him. You'll have to, as you know in the book, I talk a lot about the commissioning of the ship. And sort of like Jon Meacham writing about someone who's still alive, the poor Navy League in Norfolk had never had an aircraft commissioning where the namesake was still alive.
Yeah.
They're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And the other thing would be the CIA. And the CIA headquarters are named the George Bush Center for Intelligence. Right. Mrs. Bush loved to say in her speeches, there's a sign on the parkway in DC, the parkway on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, that says the turnoff for the CIA headquarters, and it says the George Bush Center for Intelligence. And Mrs. Bush used to like to say in her books, in her speeches, why I almost drove off the road the first time I saw that. This is the man who jumps out of airplanes. Why would you call an intelligence center for him? But it really, he was head of the CIA for less than a year under President Ford, but he was considered a transformative director, and that meant a lot to him. But yet the thing that I think he loved the most in his heart, those are the two things that sort of blew him away. He was like, wow, I can't believe they're going to name that for me. Special place in his heart for the George Bush School of Government and Public Service, which is at Texas A&M. He loved to go spend time with the students. Sometimes he would be scheduled to be a guest lecturer, but sometimes he would just drop in the classes, and that school meant a lot to him. And he hated the word legacy, but I think that school is a big part of his legacy.
Neat, very neat. You talk, as now we near the point in the book where the president is, he's really starting to ail. He has to, and here's a guy who, as you note, this is a former athlete, captain of the baseball team at Yale, very, very active guy, who now has to take to a wheelchair. How difficult was that whole situation?
It's hard for him in the beginning because of all that you just said. He'd been a great athlete, so physically active, and it was hard for him. And he was sort of like losing the election in 1992. He went through a little period of adjustment, but once again, I learned something from him. He went through, he sort of grieved his loss of physical ability, and then he got over it. And and here's what I learned from him. He didn't stay home, and he kept getting out there, and he would always, think of ways to accommodate his wheelchair. We even got a hole in his boat, Fidelity, so we could roll onto the boat. But the thing that struck me the most is the Astros wanted him to throw out the first pitch at a ball game, which they always did. He and Mrs. Bush usually together, and both he and his son would take that job very seriously. They wanted to throw a strike. They wanted to get to the plate. Well, the first time he threw out the first pitch in his wheelchair, and a lot of people thought he shouldn't do it. And what he did, and the video is just hysterical, is he looked at the catcher and he did this. So the catcher came out, and then he go, and then and finally the catcher is standing right there, and he just gives him the ball. And, good for him. He decided, okay, if I have to be in a wheelchair, I'll tell you one quick story. One of his biggest achievements as president was, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Sure.
And the ADA, and part of that is wheelchair ramps. Wheelchair ramps became the law of the land. And, you couldn't build anything, a street, a building without a wheelchair ramp. We're in downtown Houston, and we'd had lunch, and he wanted just to walk around downtown Houston a little bit. It was a beautiful day, and he's in a wheelchair and being pushed by his aide. And he says, isn't it wonderful, all these wheelchair ramps? It really makes it easy to get around downtown Houston. Good for Houston for putting in these wheelchair ramps. And I said, really? Seriously? Have you heard of the ADA Act? And he said, oh yeah, okay, good for me.
Oh, that's a great story. I love that story. Okay. I worked for President Bush, not directly, very, very indirectly. I had the opportunity to work for the fabulous Elizabeth Dole, who worked for President Bush. I so admired him that I don't even want to talk about his passing. It's a bad subject, but you write about it, at some length, and you even write about his last words to you. Tell me what those last words were.
You can't make this up. It was the evening. He died about 10 o'clock at night, and we were fairly certain we were going to lose him that day. Secretary Baker had come over a couple of times. Some family had come and gone. It's about 5 o'clock in the evening. I'm the only one in the room at that point in time, which was unusual. And I'm just talking to him. His eyes are closed. He's somewhere else. And I'm just sort of talking to him about the news of the day and holding his hand. And I had a very slight cough. I had a tickle in my throat. And I went, and he opened his eyes and he said, "Are you okay?" And it's the last thing he ever said to me. I said to him, "Yes, sir, I'm fine. I just have a little tickle in my throat." And he sort of nodded and closed his eyes again. And I love those were the last words he said to me, because his whole life, John, always cared so much about the other guy and what could he do to help the other guy. And here is this man who's dying, and I had a tickle in my throat, and he was concerned that I was okay. It was meant to be that those were his last words to me.
Yeah, well, it's just wonderful to hear that, Jean. It really is. You know, I, of course, have studied Ronald Reagan a great deal. Some of the words that he talked about that he hoped that he would be known for, a few of the qualities that he discussed are ones that I would ascribe so much so to President Bush 41. And those are the words of decency and fairness. What in your mind, Jean, is the most important thing that through living his life, or what he might have said to you, that affected you the most, that changed your life, that made you who you are?
I learned so much from him, and I hope I'm a better person for having the great privilege of being up close and personal for 25 years. He had a servant's heart. He believed, one of his favorite quotes was that any definition of a successful life must include service to others. And he not only talked the talk, he walked the walk. And he just believed you had to help your neighbor. You had to help your community. He inspired me so much watching him, everything that he did with that servant's heart. You couldn't be more right. He was decent and principled. He believed in the truth. There were a couple of times when I wanted to fudge the truth, and I remember all hell broke loose in 2016 when he leaked to Kathleen Kennedy Townsend that he was going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And there was a media firestorm, and I didn't want to lie about it. I just wanted to maybe muddy the waters a little bit, because I didn't like the firestorm it was causing. So I talked to him about it. I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "I'm pretty sure I did say that to her, and it's the truth." So he says, "Jean, let it go." You know, what a great lesson for me. And not that I'm a liar, but he just so believed in the truth. And it should be a simple thing, but we know sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
He was one of the most honest, decent men. Hugh Sidey, the great Hugh Sidey of Time magazine, once said he probably was the most decent man to ever occupy the Oval Office.
What a way to end it. Jean, this is just a marvelous contribution to history, to those that want to learn how to live a life well lived, as you described President Bush. And me personally, I can't thank you enough for it. It's just terrific. Congratulations on writing such a powerful, important work.
John, I've loved our conversation. Just like to add two things. More than anyone who I've talked to in the last couple of months about the book, you almost made me cry a couple of times. Thank you. You really touched my heart a couple of times. And I just would like to end. I think everybody there at the Reagan Library, he loved Ronald Reagan. And President Bush would be really angry at me. In fact, I'm not so sure I didn't just get a message from him that a lot of what he learned a lot from being at Ronald Reagan's side for 8 years. And he would want me to, what two great men. Anyway, thank you. This has been such an honor and privilege, and I'll forgive you for almost making me cry.
Thank you, Jean. The best to you. Farewell to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.